Hello, this is the Shouty Strawman. Today I'm going to be going over why Rapid Spin is so important in Little Cup. So for a little bit of background, we have three new Rapid Spinners that entered, but two that are really relevant to the metagame right now. And they both are really good because of Rapid Spin. They are Quaxley and Toadschool, and you may be thinking, oh, well, how good are they? How good are they in the context of the metagame? If we go over to the viability rankings for Scarlet and Violet, in A+ rank we have Toadschool, and then in A rank we have Quaxley. We also have Glimmet and Surskit. They're hazard setters, and we'll get to those in a bit as well. But that's what makes Toadschool and Quaxley having Rapid Spin so important. And what Rapid Spin does is that it frees the user from Hazard's Bind Leech Seed and gives you a speed bonus. And the big one there is the hazards as well as the speed boost. And if you're wondering, well, why are hazards so important? I don't really understand. I mean, wouldn't you just be better off attacking into your opponent as opposed to just setting up some passive damage? You want to attack into it, right? Well, if we go to the Pokemon damage calculator, and then we can go over to Mudbray. This is Restock Mudbray. It's very bulky, very defensive. It's meant to take hits, and take a lot of hits, because what it does is that it has the ability Stamina, and what it really doesn't want to have to do is have to struggle versus the opponent and take damage that doesn't otherwise want to. It's very bulky and can take hits, and then you can use Rest to get your HP back, but you would prefer not to use that if you would prefer not to rest because it can be a bit of a liability sometimes. And then up against it is a specially offensive Nasty Plot Girafarig. And the reason why that's important is because Girafarig very often likes beating over a Restock Mudbray because it's very specially offensive. And Mudbray has Stamina. Stamina boosts your defense whenever you get hit. So if you're attacking on the special side, you don't really care about this boost. Very nice. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to beat over this really bulky Mudbray. However, if we assume that you are the Mudbray user, you don't want that to happen. So if you look here, we see 59.4% chance to KO with Mudbray Earthquake versus Girafarig. And the reason why that's important is that means you're not guaranteed to get the 2-hit KO on Girafarig. It's a roll you don't know, and that could mean quite a lot. Because if you miss that 2-hit KO, Twin Beam can do a lot of damage to you back, and it's not going to be pretty. So how do you make sure that this is a much more consistent chance to KO? Well, you can put up rocks, and then we see here 93.8% chance to hit KO after Stealth Rock. That's really good odds. That means that if Girafarig wants to come in, it's going to have, like, at least before, if there wasn't any Stealth Rock, you had 59. So that's 4 in 10. So roughly 40% chance to be able to hit you with Twin Beam twice or whatever. That's pretty nice. But then also if you have Spikes up, 93.8, and then if you have both Stealth Rock and Spikes, then guess what? Guaranteed. And that can be really important for securing certain KOs on the opponent's team. If they're using a defensive Mon to try and check your offensive one, and you can just destroy them because you have Stealth Rock and Spikes up, that's really, really good. So if you're the Girafarig player, and you want to be able to switch into your Girafarig more consistently, and not have to deal with Mudbray shenanigans, then keeping those off is really important. And that's why Quaxley and Toadschool are so good. But first, well, what else is making Quaxley good? Because if you have Rapid Spin, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a great Pokemon just by that. So what Quaxley has, it's got a pretty good stat line. 55 HP, 45 defense, 45 special defense, and 50 speed. All around, pretty alright. You have a good attack stat of 65. And all of this is to say, you're pretty bulky, you're decently fast, at a minimum you're not slow. Not slow is the big thing. And you can do some good damage back with your 65 base attack stat. Your move pool's also really good. You got Roost for consistent healing, which means that, as you can see with this set, it's very physically defensive. It's got a lot of defense investment, and it can take a lot of physical hits. Then heal off the damage with Roost, so that way you're not just... That way you can still be consistent as a wall throughout the course of the game, giving you additional utility. You have Rapid Spin, you have Liquidation, which is good stab, and coming off of your base 65 attack plus stab, really good. And then you have Brave Bird in order to hit grass types, such as Toadschool or Bramblin. And the cherry on top is that your ability is Moxie, so the Pokemon's attack is raised by 1 stage if it attacks and KOs another Pokemon, which means that, combined with Rapid Spin's speed boost, you can effectively get a Dragon Dance if you manage to KO your opponent's Mon. Really, really good. And because of that, despite this being a more defensively oriented Mon because of the defense investment and Roost, you can still be very offensive with this, even though you're using Rapid Spin very defensively. Get off hazards, I don't have to deal with them for the rest of the game. well, I'm still being very active with the rapid spin, because if your opponent does not deal with Quaxley really well, then it can really easily sweep their team. So even though you're being passive by removing hazards, you'll still being an active threat to the opponent. It's really hard for you to deal with. The speed boost is really important even without the Moxie boost. And if we go to something like, oh, not that one, but as I said, Giraffe-a-Rig, it only gets up to 19 speed. So if you get a rapid spin with Quaxley, then it'll outspeed, which means that your opponent has to take an additional hit, as opposed to just coming in and then hitting it with Thunderbolt or whatever. And that can be really hard for the opponent to deal with just on the face of it, because that means that you have the initiative and it's really harder. Your opponent has to respond with either a faster Scarf Mon, which in the case of Toad School, as I'll get into a bit, if you're running max speed, that's really hard to do, or they have to tank a hit and then clap back. And that can be really risky, especially with Quaxley, because of Moxie. They can't do it with like, oh, well, they can't really... They have to be very serious about it. They can't just throw some random on, hope it works, and then if it doesn't, then like, oh, well, I'd have another option. Because of the Moxie boost. It means that it's really, really dangerous, really, really threatening. So what are you gonna do? Now, obviously, you'll still get outspeed by some Scarfers. If we go down to this double Scarf by Drifting, Scarf Magnemite will outspeed that kind of Quaxley after a boost. We have Scarf Mankey. It's got 17 speed. That'll also outspeed and be able to buff it. So, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's still really good pressure in forcing your opponent to bring out their frailer options. And if you have your hazards up, and if hazards are up on their side, like if you have spikes up and rocks, so that way whenever Magnemite comes in, or whenever Scarf Mankey comes in, that's still going to be chip damage that they have to take. That means they can't come in as reliably. And if you can wear down the opponent's Scarfer and make them into possibly Revenge KO range from something like Nimble, if we see Nimble Crab. It's got First Impression, which hits first. You also have Sucker Punch. Wearing that down to possibly let your Revenge Killer deal with them later on is really good. In addition, sometimes they just have to come in a whole bunch. So actually, if we go back to the double Scarf team, it has... So Magnemite has Volt Switch, and Mankey has U-Turn. And that means that the user switches out after damaging the target. And by having hazards up, you really limit Mankey and Magnemite. And that's why having Rapid Spin on both sides is really important. If you get rid of hazards on your side, that means that you preserve your Magnemite, you preserve your Mankey for later on in the game. And if you have them up on your opponent's side, it'll limit them by making it so that way they can't come in as often as they want. They could be in range of priority. Next up, we have Toad School. And if you're running, well, what's the niche that Toad School has? Because Quaxley had it as a defensive threat that could turn offensive very quickly. Toad School basically just does whatever you want it to do, and that's kind of crazy. You have Spore to sleep your opponent's Pokemon, which even goes through abilities like Sap Zipper due to Mycelium Mite, which is really good. Now, it does mean that you go last in the priority bracket, so if you use Spore versus a Pokemon that's slower than you, so for Quaxley, for example, if you try to Spore a Quaxley, it can Brave Bird into you first before you can get off your Spore, so that's kind of yikes. But you also get Knockoff, which removes items such as Eviolite, and what Eviolite does is that it boosts your defense and special defense by 1.5 times, meaning that if you knock off into your opponent, you get to soften them up really well. You have Earth Power as good special stab, and then you have Rapid Spin as your final move. Earth Power is for stuff like, you can hit Giraffe-Rig pretty hard. It's hard to deal with especially offensive attacks at times. You get to deal with Pawniard. That's pretty nice as well. You Oko Glimmet because it's got Rock and Poison type. I'll get to more on Glimmet in a bit. But that's a pretty alright move that you can use. But if you're like, I'm not really into using like all of this special attack investment, not having any attack investment, I want to use something else. Well, congratulations, yes you can. Because you can just use a different spread and it's a-okay. Like this one, Spikes. So Spikes, you can also use it as a hazard setter, that's not weak to being set, like just fodder for other hazards, because you also have Rapid Spin, and you still have Knockoff and Spore. But if you want to run a physical set, you can do that. If you want to run Knockoff, Giga Drain, Spikes, Rapid Spin, you can, and just go fully, like even more on the special attack as opposed to using Earth Power. It can do whatever you want it to do. It's very, 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 very flexible. And it's so dumb because it can do all this stuff. And in addition to its base stat total. So as I mentioned, that Quaxly's pretty alright with its 55 HP, 45 defense, 45 special defense. Well, Toad School has got 40 HP, 35 defense, and it's like, oh, that's kind of bad. I mean, well, you can patch it up with some investment. But you've also got 100 base special defense, meaning you can take special attacks really well on baseline without any investment. Really dumb. And it's got 70 speed, allowing it to, at max, if you run a max nature, well, boosting nature, I should say, you get up to 17 speed, meaning that, as I said before, like, oh, well, what about, you know, Mankey? Because Mankey can outspeed Quaxly if Quaxly only has one boost, and it gets up to 17 speed. But if you're running max speed Toad School, you can tie the opposing Mankey that has a Scarf, and that can be really valuable because then you can knock it off or Earth Power into it, and then deal a whole bunch of damage and not have to deal with it for late game. Really, really nice. You also have Terra types. So on Quaxly, you had Terra type flying, and that's to boost your Brave Bird as well as to have ground immunity. You are pretty flexible with Toad there as well. It can do whatever you want. You can be Terra type water, so that way it doesn't have a ice weakness while still having a pretty good defensive typing. You can also run Terra type steel. I only caution on this because then you're a lot weaker to common physical attacks such as ground and fighting. And one of the big benefits of Toad School is that its grass ground typing allows it to switch into a whole bunch of different ground types. So if we look at the viability rankings again, we have Diglett, we have Mudbray, we have Glimmet. Glimmet likes to run Mudshot, and that can be annoying. Because you lose your ground typing, you also have to be wary of Magnemite. It's not even a bad Terra type, either of water or steel. It's just something you have to keep in mind, that you're going to be weaker to a whole bunch of other Pokemon, but you can still win the matchup right in front of you. But then also, you can run Terra-type Ghost, especially if you're going to set hazards yourself. And the reason why that's important is because that means that, despite the fact that, you know, you are a Rapid Spinner, you can then block Rapid Spin yourself. One of the big drawbacks of Rapid Spin is that it's a normal-type move with only 50 base power. It doesn't hit very hard, and even if with the buffs of an increased base power and the speed boost that Generation 8 gave it, it's not going to be doing a lot of damage, and because it can be blocked, that means that you don't get your hazards gone, and you don't get the speed boost, and it could be really detrimental to you. Now, Bramblin is definitely the worst of Quaxly and Toad. Like, of the new Rapid Spinners that were introduced, it's very bad, and the main reason for that is its stats and its opportunity cost. Opportunity cost as a concept is that, alright, so I want to run a Rapid Spinner, and I have to choose between Quaxly, Toad School, and Bramblin. What benefits does Quaxly have? Well, it's very physically defensive, and it can be very threatening with Moxie. Toad School has borderline unlimited flexibility because of how good its moveset and move pool are, in addition to Mycelium Might breaking through abilities. Then what does Bramblin bring to the table? Very little is the thing, and the reason for that is its stat line's pretty bad. You have 40 HP, 30 defense, and that is like slightly worse than Toad School, but well, I mean, like, you should be able to deal with that. You can't, because it's also got 35 special defense, so one of the redeeming factors of Toad School, its really high special defense, isn't on Bramblin, so Bramblin's really frail, especially compared to even Quaxly. And the other main benefit that it has is that it's a ghost type, and what, as I mentioned before, it blocks Rapid Spin. So you're thinking, oh, well, that's actually pretty convenient, isn't it? That means I can bring in my Bramblin, which is a grass type, into Quaxly, which is a water type, and shouldn't that be a good thing? Well, the issue is that Quaxly runs Brave Bird, and because of how physically frail this is, it's going to get hit really hard, and it's not going to have a fun time. Oh, well, what about Toad School? I mean, it's got Spore, and Spore doesn't work on grass types, so that should be good, right? No, it's got Knockoff as well. So that means that you're going to be coming in on a Knockoff, meaning that your already poor bulk's going to get even worse when they remove Eviolite. And you can't do too much in return, because it could be outspeeding you and just 2-hit KO with 2 knockoffs. That could really feasibly happen, and then you just don't get your Rapid Spin off at all. So despite the fact that it's a ghost type that can also spin, it's very hard to justify. And that just shows how good Quaxly and Toad School are, that they can even threaten stuff that, in theory, could deal with them really well. The final honorable mention is Pineco, just because it's an actual Beyblade. And it's just so bulky, it's kind of crazy. It's got a really good defense stat, but Eviolite, I'm not running Sturdy on this, I'm running Overcoat. The reason for that is that Berry Juice doesn't exist, so even if you get down to like half health and proc to sturdy or something, you can in this game because berry juice doesn't exist. But it gets all hazards, it gets stealth rocks, spikes, it gets payback, and most importantly, it can still rapid spin. And the reason why it's in this section is because it's a rapid spinner that beats the spin blockers because of payback. And that's really cool. So what payback does is that your power doubles if the user moves after the target, and your speed stat is really low. And then if you look at Quaxley, it's got 14, and it's not even all that fast. We have Toad School, that's really fast. We have Bramblin, that's faster than Quaxley, but not as fast as Toad School at times. But like having payback just to bop them and be able to even possibly remove the spin blocker for the rest of the game, really, really good. And you're thinking, oh, well, isn't that kind of bad that it's really slow? And that means that even if you take the KO on the ghost type, you're just going to be kind of food. Your bulk is more than enough to compensate. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as something like Quaxley or Toad School, but it's still pretty serviceable. I mean, go ahead and try it out. And you also can run Terra-type Ghost on it, so that way you don't have to worry about getting spun on yourself. Pretty nice. But it's all your spinners. So then, what are these spinners going to be spinning away? And that's where we have the hazard setters. I said I was going to get to Surskit and Glimmet. Here we are. So first we have Sticky Web, and Sticky Web is a bit of a contentious hazard. It's been banned in previous generations, and the reason for that is it lowers the speed of grounded foes by 1 on switch-in. You know how I mentioned with Quaxley how they could outspeed a Girafarig because of the rapid spin boost? Well, the thing is that with Sticky Web up, Girafarig can outspeed it, and that can be really annoying because this is already really fast for its tier. 19 outspeeds a bunch of stuff. Just looking at this team, it outspeeds Crypt Brawler, it outspeeds Glimmet, it'll outspeed Nimble with that first impression or Sucker Punch. It'll outspeed Toad School, it'll even outspeed Pawniard. Like, that's a lot of things that you outspeed, and just because now you have to deal with Sticky Web, now you can't? I mean, that worsens your matchup significantly. I mean, like, Crypt Brawler close combat can hit you really hard. Glimmet's got Sludge Wave off of a really high special attack stat that's going to hurt. Nimble can then just U-turn on you freely. Toad School can knock you off twice, and you have a really hard time dealing with it. Pawniard can use... well, this has Iron Head, and that can be really good for flinching down your opponent, but it also gets Night Slash. So that way you can just attack into you directly, and that'll do a lot of damage, especially when it's super effective. Dark Stab. Like, it worsens its matchup significantly. And that's all from one turn of just, oh, well, look at my Sticky Web, and that's fine. This runs Terra-type Ghost to block Rapid Spin, but it's even more of a reason why stuff like Quaxley and Toad School being able to deal with that is so good. Is because, like, you have to be able to break over the Ghost types. And Toad School could do that really well with Knockoff. You also have Focus Sash on Surskit, so that way you can take a hit and still get your Sticky Web up. Afterwards, you run Hydro Pump for good step, Ice Beam in order to bonk Toad School. Its grass ground typing is pretty nice in certain matchups, but the main issue is that you got a quadruple ice weakness, and it's pretty easy to slot ice type moves on a lot of mons, so that can be pretty unfortunate. But then you also have Giga Drain for Quaxley, so there's that. Then we get to Glimmet. Glimmet was a new Pokemon introduced in this generation, and it has a very special ability in Toxic Debris. If this Pokemon is hit by a physical attack, Toxic Spikes are set on the opposing side. Now, important interaction that you have to know is that if Glimmet comes in on a Rapid Spin and gets hit, the Toxic Spikes are knocked away, actually. You don't get to set up your Toxic Spikes if your opponent uses Rapid Spin, and that's because of how Order of Operations works. So Rapid Spin would hit the Glimmet. Glimmet's ability would activate, then set the Toxic Spikes. Then after the Toxic Spikes are set, then Rapid Spin's effect activates afterwards of removing all hazards. So you don't have to worry about Toxic Debris setting up in your face if you have a Rapid Spinner out. It's a nice interaction that you have to know, but that doesn't mean that Toxic Debris is a bad ability. Being able to set Toxic Spikes by just taking a hit is really hard to deal with. So if we look at something like, we can go like Tink or something like that. It's got Knockoff, but it's kind of weak with 45 base attack stat. That can be kind of hard to do a lot of damage. But being able to come in, take that hit, set up Toxic Spikes in the face of the opponent, and then also be faster than like Stealth Rock on another Hazard Setter set. Bleh. You can set up Spikes as well. If you want to, you can also run T-Spikes on this. I would recommend it. But just being able to, as I mentioned before, passive but also offensive, with like even just by rapid spinning, it's like, oh well, I get rid of hazards. Isn't that kind of passive? Well, yeah, but you're still being very active and doing a lot of progress on your opponent because of the speed boost. And that's the same kind of logic here. Even though you're being passive and taking a hit with a mon, you're still getting advantage because of toxic debris. It's pretty nice. This set is more bulky. It's meant to come in multiple times, and that's pretty cool. But you can also run something like a Focus Sash set if you want. But it's got Mudshot for other limit, as well as slowing down setup sweepers. You know how I said before about Sticky Web lowering speed? Well, it's even pretty good on a move anyway. So if your Giraffe Rig wants to come and it's just like, oh, well, it's fine. I can just use Twin Beam to possibly bonk the Focus Sash set. Then you can just use Mudshot. It's slower, and then you're going to do a good amount of damage, and it's pretty slow. If it's trying to use the Trailblaze set, it's going to have a harder time trying to get to where it wants to be in terms of speed. It can slow it down and make it significantly more manageable. Then you have Power Gem and Sludge Wave as just good stab moves to have. You can also use, on this set, you'll run Sludge Bomb. The reason why you want to do that is because you have a higher chance to poison, and that can be more valuable. Because although having the 5 base power can help, because of how rolls work in Little Cup, it won't always, so you prefer to use Sludge Bomb instead. But then Power Gem, Spike, Stealth Rock, and this is your suicide lead. Of like, it goes out, sets up hazards, and then dies, and that's it. You have Terra-type Ghost, so that way you can not get spun on. However, if you're running a more defensive set like this one, you can run Terra-type Grass in order to not get demolished by ground-type moves. Next up, we have Pawniard, and Pawniard has a lot of sets, but Stealth Rock being one of them. And it's a really useful utility move, as well as just on a really good mon that you want to run anyway. It's got a really good stat line, high attack, a good speed stat of 16, good defense, Defiant. And the reason why Defiant's important as an interaction is because Surskit Sticky Web says that it lowers the speed. So Pawniard having Defiant means that if it comes in on webs, it gets a +2 attack bonus, and that can hit really, really hard when your 17 and when your 17 attack stat turns into 34, and then you also have Stab Sucker Punch. It can be really hard to deal with. And then also you can Terra-type Ghost on this as a spin blocker, but B, because of the Dark Steel typing, you have a quadruple fighting weakness. So you can patch that up by just turning into a ghost type and not having that weakness anymore. You're immune. So you can both rapid spin block as well as remove your weakness. Really nice. Also, you run Brick Break on this for other pawn. It's kind of funny. And like, you get to win the pawn war because if you go Terra type Ghost, then it can't Brick Break into you. That does mean that you're weak to Sucker Punch, which is why you got to be cautious. Sometimes you run Terra type Flying instead. But, I mean, just that one opportunity of brick breaking into your opponent could be really valuable. As I mentioned before, Tinkatink. It's got a lot of utility in Knockoff, Thunderwave, and Stealth Rock, and it's pretty bulky to boot. 50 HP, 64 special defense, 45 defense. It's not fantastic, but it can still work. You've also got Pickpocket, so if you get Knockoff into, so as I mentioned on Toadstool gets Knockoff and can remove items, as well as other Tinkatink itself, and it's a quadruple resist to Dark-type moves and Fairy Steel. What can happen is that your opponent you come in, your opponent knocks you off, removes your item, then because of Pickpocket, you steal your opponent's item. So you can be very punishing to opponents' knockoff attempts. Very funny. But then you also have Play Rough as good stab, Thunderwave to slow down opposing threats. So if your opponent's using Trailblaze, Giraffe Rig, or a Scarf mod, you can use Thunderwave on that, slow it down. And then Stealth Rock. Stealth Rock is the best hazard because it'll always affect every single mod. So if we go out here for a sec, so this is just going to be the Defoggers, but I'll get to these in a sec, but because they're all flying type and they're not grounded, they're not affected by spikes. And that's kind of annoying that you can't hit them with spikes, and sometimes spikes just doesn't do anything versus certain mons. Stealth Rock will always hit opposing Pokemon no matter what, and it's especially good against flying types that don't get hit by spikes because you have a rock weakness, so that can be pretty good. Then finally we have the boy, Shellos. And this is mainly it's a rain team check because you have Storm Drain as a water immunity, so you don't take any damage from them. And then you can also Terra-type Ground in order to shore up your weakness to Electric-type attacks, while still not being weak to Water types, which is pretty nice. Its big benefit is that it's got Stealth Rock, and then you also have Recover, Ice Beam, so that way you can hit Toad School, and then you have Surf as just some good stab for hitting something like Poniard. But it's pretty alright, just because like you're very bulky. It's got 76 HP, 62 special defense, 48 defense. It can be really hard to break over. Then we have more hazard setters. As I mentioned before, Toad School is a Swiss Army knife. It can set spikes and do whatever it wants. And you can also run whatever spread you want. You want to run more specially offensive, go for it. You want to run more physically offensive, go for it. More defensive, more speedy. It can do whatever you want. It's dumb. Here comes the other boy. It's Whooper. And it got spikes and Stealth Rock in this generation, so it can be pretty reliable as a hazard setter, because its typing is a little bit hard to break through, because it's only weak to grass types, and currently Girafarig is best Mon and tier if we go over the beyblade rankings. S rank is Girafarig, the number 1, and the reason why that's important is because if we go to this Girafarig, Sap Sipper, this Pokemon's attack is raised by 1 stage if hit by a grass move, grass immunity, so it can be really risky to even run a grass type move and give Girafarig a bonus. So there's that. You have Avalanche for hitting Toad School, and you have Recover to keep yourself healthy. You can also Terra type Ghost under a Spin Block. A lot of Pokemon like running Terra type Ghost if they're going to set hazards. Once again, a mention of Pineco, because you can also set T-Spikes. Toxic Spikes with this, which are set by Toxic Debris. Quick note about Toad School that I completely forgot because of how good it is. If you want to, you can also run Toxic Spikes. So there's that! But then we get to Stunky, and Stunky's kind of forgettable. And it's in this weird spot where, like, it's still good if we go to the viability rankings. It's B+, it's just kind of forgettable as a Mon. But its main niche is that, if we go back to Girafarig because of the Tier King, if it's running the specially offensive set, then Stunky can deal with it really well because of its type combination, meaning that it's only weak to ground type moves. It absorbs fighting type moves neutrally and psychic type moves. It's immune to because of Dark. Blah, 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 blah. Sometimes I can't talk. But you got Crunch and Sucker Punch as good stab and then good priority to revenge kill. Terra Blast Grass, so that way you can hit stuff like Whooper. But it's also kind of nice as just a general option to use. But then you also have Toxic Spikes, because you're kind of fast, and then something like Mariony, it's pretty bulky and wants to come in on Stunky, and if it does, then you can set up Toxic Spikes, and then your opponent has to play around it, like, oh, well, my Poison type that would be able to absorb Toxic Spikes normally can't, so as a result, I have to switch around it kind of awkwardly. It's not fun. But also, you're pretty fast. You get up to 18 speed, and that can be really important. And you hit pretty hard with Stab Crunch, Stab Sucker Punch. Very nice. And then, as I was talking about Mariony, it's borderline immortal sometimes. And the reason for that is because it's got Regenerator and Recover. It can be really hard to break through, and there's a lack of knockoff in the metagame, so it really often retains its Eviolite. But the important bit is that it also gets Toxic Spikes, which can be really nice if your kind of passive Pokemon can put pressure on your opponent and force them to make really awkward decisions, like sending in their Quaxly, which you normally wall anyway, to try and spin away the Toxic Spikes, and they can't do it too well because then they get Sludge Bomb poison, they get poisoned by the spikes, it's going to be a hard time for them. It's also a good Poniard switch in because of how high its defense stat is and how well it takes all of Poniard's usual moves. Pretty nice. Also, the other Whoopie Boy gets a special mention because it gets Toxic Spikes, gets Stealth Rock, and it also gets regular spikes. I wouldn't recommend running Whooper Paldea because you have a lot of competition in Stunky and Mariony, and it's kind of a lot of investment to put all of these hazards onto a Pokemon and making it pretty passive. You can kind of make it work, but I wouldn't recommend it. Like, this Whooper is much better because of its typing. Then finally, you may be thinking, oh, well, why don't you just use Defog instead? Because Defog also removes hazards, so why not just run those? Problem is, a lot of them are kind of bad, and you don't want to run Defog. So if we look at the Defog list of all the Defoggers that we have Drifloon, Fletchling, Fomantis, Noibat, Brookedy, and Swablu. And then if you go check the viability rankings, Drifloon is at B. And that's the first one that comes up, and that's kind of bad now, isn't it? So what about all the other ones? So if we look down in C rank, we have Wingull. And it's like a flying type, but it's not got it in this generation. Wingull has Defog in other generations. And then we go to D rank, we have Fomantis. And that's really, really sparse. That means that the best defogger is Drifloon. And Drifloon very often, actually if we go to my VR boxes, so viability rankings have dropped as I've been showing throughout the course of this video. But not everybody knows what sets to run. And the issue is that Drifloon doesn't really like running a passive set. So you can run Acrobatics with a substitute on Endure with like a Lychee Berry to boost your attack, and that can be kind of funny. And you can run a General Utility set with Acro, Lewis, substitute Defog. But this is very clearly not meant to take a whole bunch of hits, and it can get worn down kind of really fast. If we look at its ability, it's Unburden, which means that your speed is doubled on health item loss, and it's a really good ability. You run around this quite a bit, so it's kind of hard to justify using Drifloon, especially because Defog gets rid of hazards on both sides, and it's a really important distinction. So if I have my spinner in Quaxley, and then we have Rapid Spin on there, that means that even though you can set up spikes with something like Toad School, like on this set it has spikes plus Rapid Spin, and that can be really nice to use, so that way you can set up your own hazards and then get rid of your opponents. Defog doesn't allow that. It just sort of sets it all back to 0, and that can be really annoying, especially if you want to run like Glimmet. You want to run a Rapid Spinner as opposed to Defogger, so that can be really hard to justify. Otherwise, you can have Swablu with Defog, Roost, and then 2 other moves. But the main issue is that it's exceedingly passive. It's got some good bulk, 45, 60, 75, but that can be really, really, really hard to justify, having a very passive Mon. It's not great. And then the next one I have is just Fletchling because it was good in other generations, but ever since Gale Wings is nerfed to only work at full HP, it's bad. Don't run this. So there's that. Then what about the ghost types that would otherwise block Rapid Spin? Talked a lot about how Dara Ghost is good, but what about the actual ones? So Bramblin's bad, as I mentioned before, because of the opportunity cost of, well, why not just run Quaxley or Toad School? Dreepy's bad because it's got no bulk and a bunch of speed, and that's it. Drifloon, as I mentioned before, it doesn't really work too well as a Rapid Spin blocker anyway, and like as I mentioned, the sets that you really want to run are Unburdened sets, very offensively oriented. You don't want to have to come in and take a whole bunch of hits. Ghastly, I'll touch on this in a sec, because you can run an Eviolite set with Nasty Plot, and that's pretty alright. And you can have it come in and Rapid Spin block, and that's pretty alright. But I'll save that for a second to explain why it's not great. We have Gimmighoul, and it's kind of important because, like, look at this bulk: 45 HP, 70 defense, 70 special defense. Why aren't people running this? Its moveset is exceedingly shallow and has very little that it can actually do. It's not great, not great at all. But if we go to the other ghost types, then we have Grievard is probably the most noteworthy, because you can run a kind of fun set in Yawn, Stomping Tantrum, Ice Fang, and then Shadow Sneak, and then just make it very physically bulky, hard to break over, because, like, oh, well, you know how both, oh, well, that's not where I want to go, but both Quaxley and Toad School can be physical attackers, so that's a pretty good check to that. But then the issue there is that that's kind of all you're doing, and you have a really hard time attacking into something like Girafarig. And if Girafarig just gets up a really easy Nasty Plot, then you're just food for that. I think it still has a worthwhile niche because it just walls things so well, and how annoying it is because it has the ability Fluffy, meaning that you take half damage from contact moves. So that's really annoying to deal with, but it's very passive, and that can lead to a lot of liabilities. But then if we go to the other ghosts, we have Sandygast. Sandygast is just way too passive in and of itself. It wasn't good in last generation. It's not good in this one, even with Shore Up, because you're just food for setup Mons. And although you have a good defense stat, Water Compaction's a terrible ability. Don't use it. Then we have Shuppet and Sinistea, and they're not very defensively oriented anyway. Shuppet has an interesting attack stat, and that's kind of it. But Ghastly, I need to go over Ghastly, and the reason for that is you can run a pretty reasonable Eviolite Ghastly set, and it can do pretty well. But the main issue with that is if we look at Ghastly's bulk, it's 30 HP, 30 defense, 35 special defense. It's very frail. But the reason why it's actually kind of alright as a spin blocker is its speed stat, as well as the fact that, I mean, if you have Eviolite, you only really need it to take one attack to block the rapid spin, because then you can come in with other teammates like Diglett, Giraffrig, Pawniard, stuff like that, in order to revenge kill the rapid spinner. And sometimes that's all you really need. But the main issue, once again, is that you can't do that multiple times a game. If your opponent predicts correctly, then it can be really annoying. So as I mentioned, like, oh yeah, Quaxley and Toadschool are physical attackers sometimes, and Toadschool even gets stab knockoff to really ruin the opponent's Ghastly, then it can be very, very, very inconsistent as a spin blocker, and that's what makes it kind of bad. However, it's still pretty good because you can use a nasty plot set, so that way your opponent's like, ah, well, now I'm kind of scrambling to get some room back because now my Quaxley, it's kind of a sitting duck, and it's not really meant to take special attacks too much. Its special defense isn't high enough for that. So I kind of want to switch out, go into something more attuned to handling it, like a Pawniard. And then as you do that, you just do nasty plot, and then you can start firing off attacks, and your opponent can be a bit of a sitting duck. And if you have webs up, like on the Surskit team, then you can just start blasting stuff that's faster, like a Giraffrig or a Scarf Magnemite. Heck, even a Scarf Mankey can't deal with this if webs are up. So there you go. And for all those reasons, it can be alright, and it's probably the best spin blocker currently, because it can be defensive while also offensive. It can block spin, but then also threaten out the spinners. Quaxley doesn't want to take a Thunderbolt. You can run Thunderbolt on this pretty comfortably for stuff like Quaxley. Good middle ground for Pawniard. Pawniard can run Terra-type flying, and then you bop that. But it's kind of inconsistent as a result of its low bulk. And that's why Rapid Spin is so effective. It's much better than Defog because the mons that get it are more impactful over the course of the game. It doesn't get rid of your own hazards, and having hazards up is really important to your game plan and wearing down your opponent's team. Thank you very much for watching. If you really like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And thank you all very much for your time. Have a good day.